The deck of USS Guadalcanal smelled like diesel exhaust and salt water and something older, something that did not belong to the Atlantic in June of 1944. Lieutenant David points his flashlight through the open hatch, and the beam catches a world suspended in mid-action. Coffee cups still on the table, charts spread and weighted at the corners, a wool jacket draped over a chair as though its owner had just stepped away and intended to return. He had not intended to return. He had fled into the water with his crew when the American boarding party came over the side, and now the submarine sat here, low in the swells off the coast of West Africa, engines silent, flooding slowly through a damaged ballast valve, carrying inside it something that no American sailor had managed to take from an enemy at sea since the year 1815. There is a clock somewhere below decks that is still running. The Americans can hear it. What they cannot yet know is how much the papers on that chart table are about to change the war. How many ships those documents will save. How many men will come home because a boarding party swam through cold water and climbed through a hatch in the right direction on the 4th of June, 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day was supposed to already be over. The submarine is U-505, and it is sinking. Part 1. A Navy built from nothing, twice. The United States Navy is older than the United States, technically. On October 13, 1775, the Second Continental Congress authorized the construction of 2 armed vessels to intercept British supply ships. This is the date the Navy counts as its birthday. The country those ships were supposed to defend would not formally exist for another 8 months. The Continental Navy that emerged from that authorization was a ragged, improvised thing. It never numbered more than about 50 vessels at any one time. It faced the largest and most experienced naval force in the world. It lost most of its major engagements. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the treaty that acknowledged the independence of the 13 colonies and ended the Revolutionary War, the Continental Navy had been effectively destroyed, and Congress, looking at the bills, disbanded it entirely. This is the first thing you need to hold in your mind about the American naval tradition. It was born in war, dissolved in peacetime, and had to be rebuilt from scratch when the next crisis came. This pattern would repeat. The next crisis came quickly. American merchant ships, now sailing without the protection of the British Royal Navy, were prey. The Barbary states of North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, had for centuries extracted tribute from European maritime powers in exchange for not attacking their shipping. The British had paid. The French had paid. Now that American ships were no longer flying British colours, they were fair game. Algerian corsairs seized American vessels and enslaved their crews. The ransom demands were enormous. Congress, constitutionally allergic to standing military institutions, initially tried to pay. By the early 1790s, the ransom and tribute bills had become humiliating enough that something had to change. The Naval Act of 1794 authorized the construction of 6 frigates and re-established a permanent United States Navy. The 6 ships were the USS United States, the USS Constitution, the USS Constellation, the USS Chesapeake, the USS Congress, and the USS President. Each one was designed by Joshua Humphreys, a Philadelphia shipbuilder who understood that America could not outbuild the British and did not try to. Instead, he built ships that were faster than anything they couldn't outfight and stronger than anything they couldn't outrun. It was a design philosophy born from strategic realism. Stop and think about what that means. The foundational design principle of the American Navy was not dominance, it was survival. The quasi-war with France in 1798 and 1799 gave the new Navy its first combat test. The First and Second Barbary Wars gave it 2 more. The War of 1812 against Britain, the same Navy that had humiliated the Continental Navy 30 years earlier, produced a string of single-ship victories that astonished the world and gave the young republic its first genuine naval heroes. And then, in 1815, something happened that would not happen again for 129 years. During the Second Barbary War, Commodore Stephen Decatur's squadron intercepted the Algerian flagship Mashuda off Cape Gata, Spain. After a sharp engagement, the Mashuda struck her colours. Decatur's men boarded her. They took the ship as a prize. It was the last time the United States Navy would board and seize an enemy warship on the open sea before June 4, 1944. 129 years. The Civil War came and went. The Spanish-American War came and went. The First World War came and went. In each of those conflicts, the Navy fought, sank ships, and was changed by them. But the tradition of the prize, the captured enemy vessel, boarded and taken intact, had calcified into memory. By 1944, most naval officers alive had never seen it done and had never seriously considered doing it. Daniel Gallery had. The modernization of the American Navy that began in the 1880s had produced, by 1943, the largest naval force in the world. More tonnage, more carriers, more destroyers, more submarines than any other nation. The industrial capacity that had been latent in the Republic since Hamilton first imagined it had finally been fully mobilized. But size and industrial output are not the same as tactical imagination. Gallery understood this. He had been thinking about the prize problem since at least 1943, when he first took command of his hunter-killer group and began running anti-submarine operations in the Atlantic. He had written a memo. He had filed a plan. He had been told, politely, that the idea was interesting. He kept the plan. Part 2. The machine and the men who ran it. To understand what Gallery was hunting on June 4, 1944, you need to understand what a German U-boat actually was by that point in the war. Not the romantic image, not the movie version, but the specific, mechanical, operational reality of the thing. The submarine that Gallery's sonar operators were tracking that morning was U-505. She was a Type 9C U-boat, built at Deutsche Werft in Hamburg and commissioned on August 26, 1941. Type 9C was the workhorse of the Extended Range Atlantic campaign. Length 76.8 meters. Surface displacement 1,120 tons. Submerged displacement 1,252 tons. 2 MAN diesel engines for surface running, 2 electric motors for submerged running. Maximum surface speed 18.3 knots. Maximum submerged speed 7.3 knots. Operational depth 200 meters, with a tested crush depth somewhere around 250. She carried 22 torpedoes and a crew of 59 men. She had been at war for nearly 3 years. U-505's operational history was not the history of a triumphant weapon. She had gone on 12 war patrols and had sunk 8 Allied vessels, but she had also been heavily damaged twice, had suffered a serious crew morale crisis in 1942 following the suicide of her then commander, and had spent long stretches in repair yards. By 1944, she was a worn machine, crewed by increasingly young men. Meet Oberleutnant zur See Harold Lang. He was 36 years old, a career naval officer born in Lübeck, Germany. He had taken command of U-505 in September of 1943, inheriting a boat with a complicated history and a crew that had seen too much. On June 4, 1944, he was running south along the West African coast, heading for a patrol area off the Gulf of Guinea. He did not know he had been detected. The detection had happened 3 hours earlier. Gallery's task group, designated Task Group 22.3, consisted of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts: USS Chatelain, USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, and USS Jenks. This was not a standard convoy escort. This was a dedicated hunter-killer group, specifically designed to find and destroy submarines. Gallery had trained his crews obsessively. He had run exercises. He had thought through scenarios that most naval officers hadn't bothered to imagine. One of those scenarios was this: what if we don't sink it? The operational logic was not romantic. By mid-1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had already turned decisively against Germany. The combination of improved radar, long-range air patrol, convoy routing intelligence, and sheer industrial output had broken the back of the U-boat campaign. In May of 1943 alone, Black May, the Germans called it, 41 U-boats had been sunk. The strategic crisis was over. But the intelligence war was not over. The German Navy's Enigma cipher system, the machine that encrypted all U-boat communications, had been the most important intelligence target of the entire war. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading German naval traffic intermittently since 1941, but the cipher system changed. Keys rotated. New rotor settings were introduced. Every time the Germans upgraded their system, the intelligence blackout could last for weeks or months, and during those blackouts, convoys died. A captured U-boat, intact, with its Enigma machine, its current cipher keys, its operating documents, was worth more than a dozen sunk ones. Gallery had written this down. He had submitted the plan through proper channels. He had been told the plan was impractical, that a U-boat crew would destroy their Enigma and scuttle the boat before any boarding party could reach them, that the risk to American sailors was unacceptable, that the idea was interesting. He kept the plan. Here is the key detail. Gallery had not just written a plan, he had trained for it. His boarding parties, small teams of men with specific instructions, had rehearsed the scenario. They knew what to look for. They knew where the Enigma machine was likely to be located on a Type 9C. They knew which documents to grab first. They knew how to operate the bilge pumps if the crew had opened the seacocks. On June 4, 1944, the practice became real. At 8:37 in the morning, USS Chatelaine sonar operator, Petty Officer First Class Zenon Lukosius, 23 years old, from Waterbury, Connecticut, who had worked in a machine shop before the war, reported a solid contact at bearing 260. The signal was clean, the depth was 600 feet, the target was moving south at approximately 3 knots. Commander Dudley Knox aboard Chatelaine confirmed the contact and reported to Gallery. Gallery gave 2 orders in rapid succession. The first was standard, attack. The second was not. Do not sink it. Chatelaine ran in and dropped a pattern of hedgehog charges, forward-throwing anti-submarine mortars that detonated on contact rather than at depth. The charges forced U-505 to emergency maneuvers. Lang, deep in his boat, ordered crash dive protocols. The crew scrambled. Depth charges from the other escorts began falling, and then something went wrong aboard U-505. A depth charge detonated close enough to damage the submarine's diving controls. Lang, 40 meters below the surface, found himself with a boat that was no longer fully responding. The dive planes were damaged. The submarine was beginning to rise, not by choice, but because the systems that kept her down were failing. U-505 broached. She came up to the surface at 8:59 in the morning, 2 miles from USS Chatelaine, bow first, then rolling to the beam, trailing water and diesel smoke. Gallery saw it from his bridge on Guadalcanal. He did not hesitate. The boarding party was already assembled. Meet Lieutenant, junior grade, Albert David. He was 26 years old, a surface warfare officer from Maryville, Missouri, who had been studying to be an engineer before the war. He was the officer in charge of Pillsbury's boarding party. He had rehearsed this. He knew what he was looking for. As the German crew abandoned ship, Lang himself was wounded in both legs by strafing fire from Wildcat fighters flying off Guadalcanal and was pulled from the water, barely conscious. David led 8 men over the side of USS Pillsbury and into the water. They swam to U-505. They pulled themselves up her ballast tanks. They went below. The boat was flooding. Someone had opened the seacocks. David's men found the flooding and worked the hand pumps. They found the Enigma machine, a 4-rotor naval Enigma, still in place at the radio operator's station. They found the current cipher key documents, still in their waterproof bags. They found the navigational charts, the torpedo manuals, the operating procedures. They found everything. U-505 did not sink. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what Gallery actually pulled off, not the diplomatic version, not the after-action citation language, but the raw operational audacity of it, hit the like button. It helps keep this kind of history in front of people who want the real version, not the sanitized one. and that matters. Part 3. What they found and why it terrified the people who needed to know about it. The towing operation took most of the day. U-505 was taken under tow by USS Guadalcanal, and the task group made for Bermuda at the best speed the damaged submarine could manage. Gallery put the German crew, 58 men, 1 officer dead in the initial attack, under strict isolation. No communication with the outside world, no letters, no radio. This was not routine operational security. This was something more urgent. Gallery understood, with complete clarity, that if the Germans learned their boat had been captured intact, they would change their cipher systems immediately. Every intelligence advantage in those documents, every rotor setting, every key sheet, every chart notation, all of it would become worthless the moment Berlin knew. The Germans had to believe U-505 was dead. They had to believe she had gone down with her documents. He sent a message to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. King was 65 years old, a naval officer from Lorain, Ohio, who had been described by President Roosevelt as the man who shaved with a blowtorch. King's response to Gallery's message was not congratulations, it was instructions. This never happened. The crew of U-505 was transported to a prisoner of war camp at Ruston, Louisiana. They were held in strict isolation, separate from other German prisoners, with no mail and no contact with the outside world. The camp at Ruston had a special section built specifically for this purpose. The 58 men of U-505 would spend the rest of the war in that camp, completely cut off, unable to tell anyone what had happened to their boat. The Germans listed U-505 as missing, presumed lost. It worked. Now hold this detail. The cipher documents recovered from U-505 were flown to Washington and then to Bletchley Park. The Enigma machine itself, a 4-rotor M4, the naval variant that had caused the intelligence blackout of 1942 when it was introduced, was examined by cryptanalysts who had spent years working around it without ever seeing one in operational condition. What they found confirmed what they had suspected but could not prove. The Germans had introduced several modifications to their cipher procedures in early 1944. The key sheets from U-505 showed exactly what those modifications were. The cipher keys, valid for the period of the boat's current patrol, allowed Bletchley to verify their decryption methods against known plaintext for the first time in months. The intelligence officers who received these materials used a phrase in their internal communications that has since been declassified. They called the haul from U-505 a gift from God. Sit with that phrase. These were not excitable men. These were British intelligence professionals who had been reading German naval traffic for 3 years, who had watched convoys die during cipher blackouts, who had calculated the cost of not knowing in bodies and tonnage. When they wrote a gift from God, they meant it with the precision of people who understood exactly what the alternative looked like. The navigational charts from U-505 showed the current German U-boat patrol grid, the system of lettered and numbered squares that the submarines used to report their positions. The charts had handwritten annotations. They showed rendezvous points, resupply coordinates, the locations of the Milch Cow submarines that refueled and resupplied the combat boats at sea. Several of these coordinates led directly to additional captures and sinkings in the weeks that followed. The operating manuals confirmed the technical specifications of the latest German torpedo guidance systems, the depth charge evasion protocols. The specific procedures U-boat commanders used when under attack were documented in detail that Allied anti-submarine training had never had access to before. Within 6 weeks, those protocols had been distributed to every hunter-killer group in the Atlantic. But here is what all the official histories tend to understate. The most important thing recovered from U-505 was not any single document. It was the complete picture of how the system worked, how the cipher, the patrol grid, the resupply network, and the communication protocols all fitted together. Individual pieces of this puzzle had been recovered before, in fragments from documents found on sinking boats or recovered from the sea. What Gallery's boarding party brought back was the whole machine, intact, in working order, with all its current settings. It was the difference between having a key and having the lock. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Daniel Gallery did not get lucky on June 4, 1944. Luck was a minor contributor. What actually happened was the intersection of three things that almost never coincide in military operations: a correct strategic assessment, a commander with the authority and will to act on it, and a crew trained specifically for a scenario that no one else had bothered to plan for. The correct strategic assessment was this: by mid-1944, sinking U-boats was no longer the primary intelligence problem. The primary problem was cipher continuity. Gallery understood this because he had been paying attention not just to the tactical war, how many submarines sunk, how many convoys protected, but to the intelligence war underneath it. Most naval officers at his level were not thinking at that level. Gallery was. The authority question is more complicated. Gallery had submitted his prize capture plan through proper channels and had received what amounts to a polite, bureaucratic non-answer. He had not received formal authorization to attempt a capture. What he had received was the absence of a direct prohibition. When U-505 surfaced on June 4th, he made a command decision that his superiors had not explicitly sanctioned. Admiral King's first response, "This never happened," was not just operational security. It was also a senior officer processing the fact that a subordinate had done something brilliant without permission. Gallery was reprimanded. The reprimand was for breaking radio silence to report the capture before he had received authorization to attempt one. The reprimand was entered in his service record. He was also awarded the Legion of Merit. The Navy's institutional response to Gallery was, in other words, entirely consistent with its own history. The service that had been disbanded after the Revolutionary War and had to be rebuilt from scratch. The service whose foundational design philosophy was survival rather than dominance. The service that had spent 129 years not taking prizes because no one had specifically planned for it. That service rewarded the man who planned for it and then told him he had done it wrong. He had done it exactly right. Now look at the men who went below. Albert David, 26 years old, from Maryville, Missouri, led the first boarding party into a flooding, potentially booby-trapped enemy submarine, with no certainty that the crew had fully abandoned it. Two of his men, Petty Officer Arthur Nispel and Fireman First Class Stanley Wadowiak, went down the conning tower hatch first, into darkness, into a boat that was taking water, not knowing if a German sailor was waiting at the bottom with a pistol or a grenade. They were not ordered to do this in any specific sense that a court-martial would have recognized. They were asked. They went. Albert David was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was 26 years old. He died in 1953, at age 35, of a heart attack. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Arthur Nispel received the Navy Cross. Zenon Lukosius, the sonar operator aboard Chatelaine who made the initial contact, whose steady voice calling out bearings set the whole chain of events in motion, received a commendation. He went back to Waterbury, Connecticut after the war. Harold Lang, the commander of U-505, survived the war in the prisoner of war camp at Ruston, Louisiana. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He lived until 1967. The 58 surviving members of U-505's crew were held in isolation at Ruston for the duration of the war. They did not know, for most of that time, whether Germany had won or lost. They did not know that the documents from their boat had been used to track and sink other submarines. They did not know that the Enigma machine from their radio room was sitting in a laboratory in England being examined by people who had spent years trying to see inside it. They knew only that they were alive, which was more than they had expected when the depth charges started falling. The isolation held. The Germans did not change their cipher procedures in response to the loss of U-505, because they did not know U-505 had been lost intact. The cipher intelligence remained valid, the operational advantage was preserved. The plan worked. U-505 herself, the boat, the physical object, was towed to Bermuda, then to the United States. After the war, she was transferred to the city of Chicago, where she has been on display at the Museum of Science and Industry since 1954. She is the only German U-boat on display in the United States. She sits in a purpose-built pavilion, 76 meters of grey steel, her deck fittings intact, her torpedo tube still in place, her radio room, where the Enigma machine sat on June 4, 1944, accessible to visitors who walk through and take photographs. 129 years. That is the distance between Stephen Decatur boarding the Mashuda off Cape Gata in 1815 and Albert David going down the conning tower hatch of U-505 in the North Atlantic in 1944. 129 years during which the United States Navy fought wars, built and rebuilt itself, grew from 50 improvised vessels to the largest fleet in the world, and did not once succeed in boarding and taking an enemy warship on the open sea. Gallery broke that streak, not because he was luckier than anyone else, and not because the opportunity had never presented itself before. He broke it because he had written the plan, trained the men, and kept the plan even after his superiors told him it was interesting. The word interesting in military bureaucracies is where good ideas go to be forgotten. Gallery did not forget. If this investigation gave you something real, a clearer picture of what it actually took, not just the courage on the day, but the years of thinking before the day, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. And remember this, the 129-year gap between Decatur and Gallery was not a gap in opportunity, it was a gap in imagination. One man filled it, one plan, filed and ignored and kept. That is what the distance actually measured. On the morning of June 4, 1944, Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge of USS Guadalcanal and watched U-505 break the surface 2 miles away. He had been thinking about this moment for at least a year. He had the plan, he had the men, he had the training. He gave the order, do not sink it.